In 2005 and 2006, documentary filmmaker Paul Kimball polled a select group of the world's leading UFO researchers. He asked each for a list of their 10 best UFO cases of all time. The cases were assigned point values, then averaged together. Over 70 UFO incidents from around the world received votes. At the end of the process, the following 10 incidents comprised the best evidence UFO cases of all time. Though unidentified flying objects first gained a place in modern culture with Kenneth Arnold's sighting in 1947, and the thousands upon thousands of sightings ever since, the phenomenon itself was known long before that, from reports of airships in the late 19th century all the way back to biblical times.
It appears to me that one can make a good case that there's nothing new about flying saucers. Earthlings have observed strange things flying in the sky that weren't birds. After all, before we were flying airplanes or balloons, what else was flying in the sky besides birds?
The history of this thing seems to go back, if not hundreds, thousands of years. We have portraits painted back in the 1400s and 1300s, and before that, Japanese wood carvings and so on, depicting these things. And I don't know, it's pretty hard to blow it off when you see these things, and they look pretty much the same as what everybody's reporting now. Did they know something we didn't know back then, or did they assume something we don't assume now?
Of all the artistic portrayals of what may be UFOs from the pre-1947 era, perhaps the most important can be found in a wood carving of an incident that occurred in 1561 in Nuremberg, Germany. At dawn on April 14, 1561, the skies over Nuremberg were reportedly filled with a multitude of objects, seemingly engaged in an aerial battle. Small spheres and disks were said to emerge from large cylinders. The objects were described in the Nuremberg Gazette as behaving in much the same way as some modern UFO reports, in that some of the objects would emerge from a larger object, or, as we might call it today, a mothership. But if these objects have been seen and recorded since antiquity, why have they become so much more prevalent in modern times? Stanton Friedman offers a theory.
Everybody in the neighborhood is concerned about their own survival and security. That means keeping tabs on the primitives in the neighborhood. And since they all know that things change with time, thinking beings have a habit of learning how to do things better and differently, you check them out every once in a while, but only closely once they show signs of being able to bother you. Boy, the end of World War II was certainly such a time. Evidence of nuclear weapon explosions, rockets being fired, and powerful electronics, radar systems and all that sort of stuff. So suddenly, it became incumbent upon the powers that be in the local neighborhood to check us out. Make sure we don't take our brand of friendship out there.
Probably the only unexplained astronaut UFO case on record is the Skylab 3 case from September 20th, 1973. In this case, 3 astronauts, Alan Bean, Jack Lausma, and the first scientist in space, Dr. Owen K. Garriott of Stanford University, sighted a bright red, flashing object outside their spacecraft. They observed it for 10 minutes and took 4 color photographs. Dr. Garriott measured the delay between when Skylab 3 went into the Earth's shadow and when the UFO went into the shadow. This gave him a distance measurement which showed the object to be between 25 and 30 miles away and over 800 feet in diameter.
Now that is extraordinary. No one has ever orbited an object over 1,000 feet in size in space. In fact, at that time in 1973, the Skylab itself was the largest object ever put in orbit.
I've spoken with a number of astronauts, and if you remember what the original requirements were, they had to be the best of the best. They all had to be pilots, for one thing. And pilots are familiar with things in the atmosphere. They don't live very long if they're not. So yes, I'm very impressed with astronauts. Are they 100% perfect about everything? Of course not, but that isn't the question. Are they as dependable as anybody else? I'd say yes, more so than most.
What makes this a great case is that you have the highest caliber of witnesses imaginable. You have photograph data, you have optical ranging data, and you have size data from a combination of all that. There's nothing like it in history.
One of the hallmarks of a best evidence UFO case is one where there are multiple independent witnesses who all observe the same thing. On December 11th, 1996, in 3 separate areas along the Klondike Highway in Canada's Yukon Territory, dozens of witnesses observed a massive UFO that has been estimated to have been almost a mile in length.
The Yukon case is emblematic of what a good case should be. I mean, sure, we'd like to have a piece of the craft. We'd like to have the crew member introduced for dinner, but multiple independent witnesses lasting a long time describing something that's way outside the norm. There's no way you can make it into a 747, for example, and big, but this was much, much bigger than a 747.
The first sightings occurred at approximately 8:30 p.m. at Fox Lake, where 6 witnesses reported seeing a huge UFO moving slowly across the frozen lake. They described a smooth and solid object that did not make any noise. Less than half an hour later, in the village of Pelly Crossing, a 2-hour drive north of Fox Lake, other groups of witnesses observed the same UFO. Shortly thereafter, in the village of Carmax, 4 men in a truck and a family of 5 through their living room window also sighted the UFO. What did all of these witnesses see that cold December night in 1996? How could a UFO be so large? Stanton Friedman has a theory.
I like it partly because I've often talked about you'd use a very large vehicle to go between the stars and small Earth excursion modules to flit around down in the atmosphere where you've got big gravity, high pressure, all the other things. So I like the case. It's got a lot of data, careful investigation, just a top-notch example of good UFO story.
Did dozens of people in Canada's Yukon Territory see an extraterrestrial version of an aircraft carrier in December 1996? 10 years later, after thorough investigation, all that can really be said was that they saw a flying object that remains unidentified. Perhaps no UFO case is more worrying than one which appears to compromise national security, and there are few places more secure than a nuclear missile launch site, like the one near Malmstrom, Montana, at which Captain Robert Salas was stationed one morning in March 1967.
Early in the morning, and I get a call from the topside flight security controller or guard, and he said that a few of the guards had been seeing some strange lights flying around in very strange ways, making very rapid movements, stopping, making very sharp turns. So I just kind of discounted it, and basically hung up on him. He calls back about 5 minutes later. This time he's very agitated. He's yelling into the phone, screaming. Sir, there's a large red glowing object that's hovering right outside the front gate.
Lieutenant Salas ordered the guards to secure the perimeter, and he went to inform his commander. At this point, the warning lights in the control center went off, and the missiles shut down, one after another. What made this event even stranger, if that's possible, was the fact that the exact same thing had happened 1 week earlier at Echo Flight, approximately 25 miles away. A lengthy investigation was conducted, but no positive cause for the shutdowns was ever found, despite extensive and concentrated effort.
Missile officers are highly trained, engineering and science types for the most part. And the air police, these people go through special security schools. They have secret clearances, that sort of thing. They carry weapons. They're highly trained people. So I think it's very significant when people of this caliber make sightings. The tragedy is that we don't know all the details of the reports. They've been kept secret.
I was there for another 2 years at Maelstrom. This incident was never brought up again in any of our briefings, and we were told not to talk to anybody about it. Over the years, it became more and more clear to me that what occurred was something that can't be explained as originating from Earth.
I'm quite impressed with the Malmstrom case, not only because of the people involved, and there were quite a few people involved. It wasn't just a flyover by a flying saucer, oh, what went by. But the impact on the equipment that was there, I mean, it's kind of scary when you think of missiles being affected by a foreign power, if you will. And remember, it's one of a number of cases around SAC bases. There was a whole wave of sightings.
Indeed. Over the past 60 years, there have been dozens of sightings in and around sensitive nuclear facilities. At least one person who was there is certain that there was a purpose.
I'm convinced that we were visited by some extraterrestrial object, and that there was not only visited, but there was a definite message. And the message was, get rid of your nuclear weapons.
One of the most extraordinary UFO encounters of the 20th century occurred in the tiny fishing community of Shag Harbor on the southern tip of Nova Scotia. On the evening of October 4th, 1967, several residents of the village noticed a rather strange grouping of 4 orange lights. A number of witnesses watched these lights flash in sequence for several minutes, and then suddenly and rapidly dive in a sharp 45-degree angle toward the water's surface. On hitting the water's surface, the lights did not immediately disappear, but seemed to float on the surface approximately 1/2 mile from the shore. Several reports to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police prompted 3 officers to investigate. Their reports indicate that they observed what the witnesses had: orange lights floating on the water. The officers, along with dozens of witnesses who had gathered on the shore, watched as the orange light slowly changed to yellow, and the dome-shaped object appeared to move slowly across the surface of the water, leaving a yellowish foam in its wake. After about 5 minutes, the object submerged beneath the water. The military was called in to investigate. Years later, UFO researchers Don Ledger and Chris Stiles uncovered the fact that the object that dove into the waters off Shag Harbor had been tracked. It had actually traveled underwater for a distance of about 25 miles to a place called Government Point. where the United States maintained a technically advanced military base for tracking submarines. At this point, the United States Navy also became involved in the investigation. As the Navy waited, the detection equipment picked up another object entering the area underwater. It joined the first object on the ocean floor. For nearly a week, the Navy vessels held their position over the UFOs, until the UFOs began to move towards the Gulf of Maine. The objects distanced themselves from the ships that pursued them, and then broke to the surface and shot skyward, where they vanished within seconds.
What's different about the Shag Harbor incident, or the UFO incident, is that the witnesses, the lay people, claimed they saw an airplane or crashing into the harbor. They thought it was an airplane, and it was the military who classified it as a UFO. Usually it's the other way around. The lay people call it in and say they saw a UFO, and the military will say it's just misinterpretation of a prosaic object in the sky. Could be an airplane or a planet or a star or something like that, or a satellite. So this was different. It was completely switched around from the usual concept.
The Shag Harbor incident occurred over water and then underwater. As the old saying goes, the oceans of the world hide a lot of history and a lot of mystery. The difference with Shag Harbor, Nova Scotia, is that in 1967, the waters there may well have held a mystery that was literally out of this world. It's a history that the Canadian and American governments still keep secret 40 years later. Kelly Johnson was the world's leading aircraft designer of his time, and at the time of his sighting, he was in the process of designing the U-2 spy plane for the Central Intelligence Agency. Johnson was on the ground with his wife in Agoura, California, when, unbeknownst to him, a crew of his top flight test engineers and his chief aerodynamicist were aboard a Lockheed WV-2 aircraft flying over Long Beach, and they saw the same object at the same time from a different angle. These different angles allowed researchers to triangulate the location of the object with precision. The aircraft was flying to the northwest. Kelly Johnson and his wife were looking due west. For 6 to 7 minutes, these two groups of observers saw a 200-foot-long, black, flying wing-shaped object hovering motionless over Santa Barbara Channel off the south coast of California. This object was at an altitude of roughly 15,000 feet. The aircraft flew directly towards it to see if they could get closer and get a better view. Meanwhile, Johnson started to observe the object with his binoculars, and he was able to see the object take off at high speed out over the Pacific, while his crew also observed the same thing from their different location. The object accelerated at about 130 Gs to 90 miles altitude until it disappeared. In his official report, Kelly Johnson stated, quote, "I am now more firmly convinced than ever that such devices exist, and I have some highly technical converts in this belief."
So if there's one guy who ought to know what was flying around the country at that time, it would be Kelly Johnson. And he was certainly in a position to evaluate what he was seeing. And when he talks to somebody else, another one of his trusted people, and they saw the same thing, I don't see how anybody can throw that out. We're not talking about a 2-second observation at 3 a.m. by the town drunk. We're talking about Kelly Johnson at the top of the aerospace design business.
The United States Air Force concluded that Johnson and his crew had seen a lenticular cloud. Despite the nature of the sighting, the quality of the witnesses, and the fact that the witnesses themselves specifically considered and ruled out that explanation. You would think that the government would perhaps reconsider its employment of a man who could not tell a lenticular cloud from a structured aircraft. But Kelly Johnson continued designing the most advanced and secret aircraft in the world for decades to come, none of which could move like the one he saw on December 16th, 1953. In the search for top UFO cases, skeptics will often ask why there aren't better UFO photos available. In fact, there are UFO photos out there that have withstood expert analysis, the best of which come from McMinnville, Oregon, taken on May 11, 1950, by farmer Paul Trent.
By analyzing the two photos, it was possible to determine where he stood, where Mr. Trent stood when he took the two photos, to within accuracy of a foot or so. And so if you imagine looking down from above, you can plot where he was standing and where the sighting lines went out. Now, they said that this object moved to the left, moved southward as they're looking towards the west. It moved slightly between pictures. And in fact, he was standing in one location for the first photo, looking, let's say, this way, and then he moved a little bit to the north. As this object was traveling along, he didn't want it to get blocked by the nearby garage, so he moved a little bit to his right, and then he looked and took a photo that was in this way, and the sighting lines crossed. Now, the overhead wires can be positioned where they were, and the sighting lines did not cross under the wires. So, you know, if it was a model, it wasn't hanging straight down under the wire.
The two photographs taken by Paul Trent provided a stereoscopic pair of pictures that gave researchers the data necessary to determine and measure distances to objects within a short range of the camera.
His altitude, or the altitude of the camera, also dropped by about a foot. So not only do you have a horizontal triangulation method, but you have a vertical triangulation method. Now, when you combine those two methods of distance determination, you can determine the distance to every short-range object in those photos. And the UFO model, if that's what it was, does not fit. It is not at the close range of those overhead wires that are about 15 feet away from the camera. They don't fit the locations and distance of the garage or the house, or the trees that were several hundred feet away in the background.
There's no indication that they actually, that this was a hoax, that the indications are totally that they actually saw some object flying past their farm and took two photographs of it.
In the 1960s, the U.S. Air Force contracted an outside scientific study of UFOs to be conducted by the University of Colorado. The astronomer William Hartman concluded that this is one of the few cases in which all of the geometric, photometric, and photogrammetric aspects agreed that there was an object, extraordinary object, tens of meters in size and metallic in appearance, about a mile away, which would seem to be consistent with an alien visitation, even though that's pretty hard to believe.
Hard to believe? Perhaps. But in the McMinnville case, it's hard to escape the conclusion that a picture really is worth 1,000 words. One of the best documented and most famous encounters by military personnel with a UFO occurred between December 26 and December 28, 1980, in Rendlesham Forest in the United Kingdom, near two air bases, RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge, which were at the time leased to the United States Air Force. At approximately 3 a.m. on the 26th, a U.S. Air Force security patrol observed strange lights above the forest. A 3-man security unit was dispatched from Bentwaters to investigate. All three men closed in on an object that resembled an aircraft on fire. The senior NCO, Sergeant Jim Peniston, claimed that he got close enough to see a structured object. There was then a silent explosion of light, and the object disappeared in a blur towards the coast. The following evening, strange lights were again seen in the forest. The deputy base commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt, took a squad out to investigate. What he saw that night continues to defy explanation.
It appeared to be like an eye. That's the best way I can describe it. Had a dark center and appeared to be dripping something molten, as though it were something pouring from like steel from a crucible. The object came even closer. It moved through the trees, going horizontal, up and down a little bit as it went. We were really in awe at this time. So we tried to get closer. When we moved toward the object itself, the object receded out into the field. We watched it there in the field for a few minutes, and then it very silently exploded and broke into, I believe it was 5 white spheres, small spheres, and they just disappeared. While we're standing there in awe, one of the party members looks up and says, "Look in the sky." We looked up, and there to the north were several objects, 3 objects that were elliptical, and they had multi-colors. They were moving at high speed, at sharp angular movements, as though they were doing a grid search or something. I really can't say what for sure, but they were moving about quite rapidly. We noticed to the south there were several objects there. One particular one approached us at very, very high speed, probably 3,000 to 4,000 feet high, maybe a little more. Stopped almost directly overhead and sent a beam down to our feet. The interesting thing about the beam was the beam didn't radiate out. It was a steady beam, about 10, 12 inches in diameter. Not like a flashlight beam that spreads out as it goes. So obviously it wasn't a normal light beam, something more like a laser. We stood there in awe, quite concerned. But, was it signaling us, warning us, trying to injure us? We really weren't sure what it was trying to do, but we were really concerned at that point. And just as suddenly as it appeared, it disappeared.
Rendlesham is Britain's best-known UFO incident. Arguably, it's one of the world's most important UFO cases. What makes it so important is that everything that makes a UFO case good happened here all at once. Firstly, you had an incident which happened over a series of different nights, so it's not just a one-off. Secondly, the witnesses, most of them were military, so you've got trained observers. Thirdly, you've got trace evidence, and this is absolutely critical. The UFO landed. Markings were found in the forest floor where this thing had come down on a tripod-like device. And critically, when the base personnel checked this area with a Geiger counter, the radiation readings were assessed by the Defence Intelligence staff at the Ministry of Defence as being significantly higher than background.
It's just a very solid case in terms of all kinds of physical evidence, highly trained, reputable witnesses, everything you would want, except once again it's been muddied up. And once again, somebody in the government is lying about it and distorting the picture and hiding the truth.
In the quarter century since the Rendlesham case occurred, Charles Halt, who retired from the U.S. Air Force as a colonel, has come to the same conclusion, that there is much more to this case than meets the eye.
Several years later, I started running into people that were involved that I didn't realize were on the edge or had picked up bits and pieces from here. For instance, one of the radar operators in the tower at Eastern Radar, who had air defense responsibility for that sector, told me that they actually picked up objects on the screen that night and had them on tape, but somebody took the tape. Then a couple of the young troops came forward and said, after the incident, that the 3 people that were involved that went out and approached the craft were taken into a room and pumped full of drugs and hypnotized and debriefed, so to speak. And then I found out a mysterious C-141 landed soon thereafter with an unusual crew and all sorts of things. The aftermath is quite interesting. It's very obvious there was a great deal more interest than was ever publicly or openly admitted to anybody, including the senior officers on the base.
To this day, No one knows for sure what happened in Rendlesham Forest between December 26th and December 28th, 1980. But one thing seems certain. Whatever these Air Force personnel saw on those nights was something more mysterious and perhaps otherworldly than the government would like us, and even them, to believe. At about 12:30 a.m. on September 19th, 1976, the Imperial Iranian Air Force command post at Tehran received several telephone reports from citizens of strange lights in the sky. The command post contacted General Nader Yousefi, Assistant Deputy Commander of Operations. General Yousefi took a look for himself and saw a very bright object, larger than a star. At that point, he decided to scramble one F-4 Phantom jet from Cherokee Air Force Base in Hamadan.
Everybody was worried about incursions by the Soviets, flying aircraft over non-Soviet territories. So they had considered the possibility that this might be some incursion by the Soviets, but when they saw this multiple flashing light stuff going on, it made no sense to imagine that it would be the Soviets trying to covertly fly over Iran for whatever reason.
You don't scramble if you're not worried. And once you've established it's not a Soviet airplane or something like that, why do you keep chasing?
At 0130 hours, the F-4 took off and proceeded to a point 40 nautical miles north of Tehran. It was noted that the object was of such brilliance that it could be seen up to 70 miles away. When the F-4 came to within about 25 nautical miles of the object, the jet suddenly lost all instrumentation and communications. The pilot broke off the intercept and turned away. When the F-4 had turned back towards its airbase, the aircraft regained instrumentation and communication. At 0140 hours, a second F-4 was scrambled. Closing on the object at 150 nautical miles per hour and at a range of 25 nautical miles, the object began to move, keeping a steady distance of 25 nautical miles from the F-4.
The pilot described the object as being flashing colors. It had some size to it, but he couldn't really see a size or shape because it was so bright, but it was flashing multiple colors at a high rate of speed. They all blurred together, he said. Certainly something unlike what we would expect to be in the skies anywhere, to say nothing of over Tehran.
While the object and the F-4 continued on a southerly path, a smaller, second object detached itself from the first and advanced on the F-4 at a high rate of speed. The pilot, believing he was under attack, tried to launch a Sidewinder missile, but he suddenly lost all instrumentation, including weapons control, and all communication. The F-4 pilot then took evasive action. The object fell in behind him at about 4 nautical miles distance for a short time, then turned and rejoined the primary object. The main object then flew away at several times the speed of sound. Once again, as soon as the F-4 had turned away, instrumentation and communications were regained.
The fact that anybody can cause sophisticated military aircraft to lose important systems at their whim, because the systems came back on, 2 different airplanes after all, that's scary. Because Iran was a close ally of the United States at that time, the Americans were called in and they helped in the investigation. The Defense Intelligence Agency report that was filed because of that investigation went to the Central Intelligence Agency, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Department of State, the White House. It was clearly considered important.
The DIA report concluded the value of this information was high, timely, and of major significance. Quote, "This case is a classic which meets all the criteria necessary for a valid study of the UFO phenomenon." The best evidence UFO case of all time occurred on the 17th of July, 1957, when a United States Air Force spy plane had a close encounter with an unidentified flying object. The 6-man crew of an RB-47 aircraft, which was equipped with state-of-the-art electronic countermeasures equipment, including 3 electronic intelligence stations manned by highly trained Air Force personnel known as Ravens or Crows, were literally tailgated by an object that continues to defy explanation to this day.
This plane was flying out of Forbes Air Force Base, Kansas, and the crew was on a training mission to shake down the airplane and test out its components. This crew detected and recorded on wire recorders and tape recorders the electronic signals, radar-like in nature, that came from the same direction and location as the UFO. It followed them and then overtook them as they flew over Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, and Oklahoma for over 2 hours that night.
The crew involved in the UFO incident was one of the top crews in the wing. They were instructors and evaluators in the standardization division and were highly respected. They had the most experience and the best training. The aircraft commander, in fact, Lou Chase, he made a landing after takeoff. One of the outboard engines froze up and broke the wing off there, and he brought the aircraft back in to test his skill and as a pilot. In the back end, the 3 crows back there were the most experienced, and they trained all of the new crows coming into the wing. Provenzano and McClure trained me when I came in, as a matter of fact. Eventually, these guys were not on the same crew because they had so much experience and knowledge that they were put on separate crews and became 3 instructors and evaluators within the wing.
As the RB-47 moved over Texas, a brightly lighted object appeared and began to follow the aircraft. Major Chase contacted Radar Station Utah at Duncanville, Texas, which confirmed that their radar had also detected the UFO.
You have a very experienced crew of a very sophisticated airplane having something very strange happen. They see it, they pick it up on their electronics, the whole crew is involved, ground radar is involved, it lasted for a long time. What more can you ask for?
The UFO continued to play tag with the RB-47, which had left its scheduled flight path to pursue the object, until the aircraft began to run low on fuel and turned to head home. The UFO followed the aircraft until the signal finally faded as the crew approached Oklahoma City. In his report on the incident, the Director of Intelligence of the 55th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing stated that he had, quote, "No doubt the electronic signals coincided exactly with visual observations by aircraft commander numerous times, thus indicating positively the object being the signal source." End quote. The Air Force, via Project Blue Book, without any real investigation, concluded that the sightings in northern Texas were an ordinary jetliner. In doing so, they failed to explain the ongoing nature of the incident over several states, the appearance and disappearance of the object, both visually and on radar and electronic countermeasures equipment, and how exactly the Utah radar station failed to distinguish between an airliner that was 600 miles away from the RB-47 and a UFO. Researcher Brad Sparks explains why the RB-47 case is the best ever, contrary to what the United States Air Force said.
Why is it so important? Because it's the only time in history that radio or radar signals have been detected and recorded from a UFO, not just are using radars to bounce signals off a UFO. We're actually detecting something that the UFO seems to be sending out.
This indication of intelligence makes the Blue Book explanation even more absurd, as does the fact that this was not the only time an RB-47 encountered a UFO. Colonel Bruce Bailey recounts his own similar incident.
We were flying a Common Cause mission. This was during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we flew a mission every day to go down and take a good close look at Cuba and to identify any site that should fire on the U-2 or any other U.S. vessel or aircraft. And on this mission, we would fly down to New Orleans and hit a tanker right over the Gulf of Mexico out of New Orleans, get filled up with fuel, and then head on to Cuba. Well, on this mission, shortly after completing our air refueling, we had some aircraft or something come up, bright light, and intercept us, and ground control was tracking it. They could copy it too. And it wasn't with us that long, probably a total of 10 minutes, but that was broken in the middle with a gap of about 2 minutes when it went away. The difference in our experiences than the other crew was our equipment in the back end. All we got was noise. It just wiped us out. We didn't get any intelligible signals at all.
When asked what it was that they encountered over the Gulf of Mexico, Colonel Bailey, a decorated Air Force veteran, can only offer the same conclusion reached by Major Chase and his crew 5 years earlier.
Unidentified flying object is what would explain it, I guess, because the crew up front could see it. We had no windows in the control compartment. We couldn't see anything. But they could see it, and what they saw jived with what ground control was reporting, and the navigator could also track it on his radar. And it all tied together. There was something there, and it had a capability far greater than anything we could do. In the incident that you're talking about, as well as the incident with my crew, the follow-on was pretty much the same. You had a very thorough debriefing, and in that debriefing you were assured that you didn't see anything, you didn't hear anything, you didn't do anything, and that you would not say anything about it. I've heard of other crews and such running into similar treatment after they reported a UFO, and it got to the point that sometimes you would see something that would actually be a UFO, meaning it's unidentified, but you wouldn't say anything about it, because if you started harping and talking about a UFO incident, it was a good way to end a military career.
Apparently, as far as the United States Air Force was concerned, when its top crews, who were charged with protecting the security of the nation in the midst of the Cold War, and who often came face to face with the enemy, saw something like this, they were really just mistaking it for a civilian airliner. If that was true, any sensible Air Force should have grounded those crews immediately. But instead, they kept on flying, so long as they stayed quiet about what they really saw in the skies above us. When one examines the best evidence UFO cases of all time, it becomes clear that the UFO phenomenon is worldwide in scope. The 10 best cases you have just seen come from Canada, Germany, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Iran. But if this had been a top 20 list, you would also have seen cases from Brazil, Australia, Japan, New Guinea, France, and New Zealand. This body of evidence compels us to ask the following questions. What should be done about the UFO phenomenon? And what does it all mean? For an answer, we turn to author and researcher Mac Tonnies, who hails from Independence, Missouri. The conclusion that Tonnies has reached is simple but profound. We don't know what UFOs are, but the scientific community should be trying harder than it is to find out.
whatever UFOs might ultimately prove to be, and we might never find out, it seems to me that they are definitely worth scientific consideration, if for no other reason than they affect how we think and how we perceive our universe. They apparently have been recurring throughout time, and they have infringed upon our belief systems to the point where we now think of the alien as something very specific. And if for no other reason than understanding how our mind reacts to the presence of a possible other in our midst, I think it's imperative that we understand UFOs and what they are. If, on the other hand, they are physical objects or paraphysical objects, which might be the case, and I don't think we have a proper vocabulary for that yet, frankly, I think that it's doubly important that we understand what these things are. Because if they're real, if they're craft of some sort, if they're disinformation devices, then it seems to me that what they are doing is influencing the way we think, influencing our mythologies and our collective way of knowing ourselves. And I think that's a pretty sacred thing to be messing with. And it would certainly behoove us to understand what we're dealing with.